The afternoon sun beat down on Officer Reynolds as he sat in his patrol car, hidden just enough behind the large oak tree at the corner of Maple and Pine. His fingers tapped impatiently on the steering wheel as he watched cars roll through the wealthy neighborhood. Most people slowed down at the stop sign across the intersection, but few came to a complete halt. Still, Reynolds wasn't interested in most people today. He straightened up when he spotted the silver BMW approaching the intersection. The car slowed down considerably, came to what appeared to be a complete stop, and then proceeded through. Reynolds smiled to himself and flicked on his lights. The BMW pulled over immediately, tires crunching on the pristine suburban gravel. Reynolds took his time, checking his appearance in the rearview mirror before stepping out of his patrol car. He enjoyed this part, the power of making someone wait, wondering what they'd done wrong. As he approached the driver's side window, Reynolds noticed the man inside was wearing a button-up shirt and tie, his posture straight and proper. The window rolled down smoothly, and the driver looked up with a polite, questioning expression. "License and registration," Reynolds said, skipping any greeting. "Good afternoon, officer," the driver replied with a deep, measured voice. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" Reynolds let out a small chuckle. "You ran that stop sign back there." The driver's eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm quite certain I came to a complete stop, officer." "Well, I'm quite certain you didn't," Reynolds mimicked, his tone mocking. "License and registration, please." The driver took a slow breath. "My name is Dr. Anthony Wilson. I live just 3 blocks from here on Oakwood Drive." He reached carefully for his wallet. Reynolds watched with narrowed eyes. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. In this neighborhood, we follow the rules." Dr. Wilson paused, his hand still on his wallet. "I assure you, officer, I follow the rules meticulously. I've been driving for over 20 years without so much as a parking ticket." Reynolds laughed again, louder this time. "Yeah, right. And I'm sure you bought that car with your hard-earned money, too." The doctor's face remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes, a familiar pain, quickly masked. He handed over his license and registration without another word. Reynolds snatched the documents. "Sit tight. Don't go anywhere." As he walked back to his patrol car, Reynolds noticed a couple walking their dog on the sidewalk across the street. They had stopped to watch the scene unfold, concern visible on their faces. Reynolds nodded at them as if to say, "Nothing to worry about, just doing my job." The couple didn't nod back. Inside his patrol car, Reynolds took his time entering Dr. Wilson's information into the system. Through his windshield, he could see the doctor sitting perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock. Reynolds smirked. At least this one knew how to behave during a traffic stop. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "All units in the vicinity of Maple and Pine. We have a report of a disturbance at 1242 Elmwood Avenue." Reynolds ignored the call. Other officers would respond. He was busy with his stop, and he wasn't finished yet. The computer beeped as Dr. Wilson's information appeared on the screen. Reynolds leaned forward, his interest piqued. The license was legitimate, and the registration matched the vehicle. Address on Oakwood Drive, just as the man had said. Reynolds frowned, scrolling down to see if there were any priors, any reason to extend this stop. A car pulled up behind his patrol vehicle. Reynolds checked his mirror and saw it was another police car. Officer Chen stepped out and approached Reynolds' window. "Everything okay here?" Chen asked, glancing toward the BMW. "Just a routine traffic stop," Reynolds replied. "Guy ran the stop sign." Chen peered at the intersection. "That 4-way? People blow through that all the time." "Yeah, well, this one needs to learn the rules apply to everyone." Reynolds kept his eyes on the computer screen. Chen studied Reynolds for a moment. "You sure that's all this is about?" Reynolds finally looked up, his expression hardening. "What's that supposed to mean?" Chen held up his hands. "Nothing, man. Just checking if you need backup." "I'm fine," Reynolds said curtly. "You can go." Chen hesitated, then nodded and returned to his car. Reynolds watched him drive away before turning his attention back to the BMW. The doctor hadn't moved an inch. Reynolds grabbed the documents and stepped out of his patrol car again, walking with deliberate slowness back to the BMW. When he reached the window, Dr. Wilson looked up with the same composed expression. "Do you know why I really pulled you over today?" Reynolds asked, leaning down to the window. I believe you said I ran a stop sign, which I respectfully disagree with, Dr. Wilson replied evenly. Reynolds tapped the license against his palm. You know, we get a lot of reports of cars that don't belong in this neighborhood. People who don't live here casing houses looking for opportunities. Dr. Wilson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As I mentioned, I live 3 blocks away. On Oakwood Drive, so you say. Reynolds handed back the license and registration. But I've been patrolling this beat for 6 years and I don't recall seeing you around. I've lived here for 8 years, Dr. Wilson replied. I leave early for work and often return late. And what exactly is your work, Dr. Wilson? Reynolds emphasized the title with subtle disbelief. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at Memorial Hospital. Reynolds laughed again, the sound sharp in the quiet street. A heart surgeon, really? Dr. Wilson didn't respond, just held Reynolds' gaze steadily. A jogger slowed down as she passed, openly watching the interaction now. Reynolds straightened up slightly, aware of the growing audience. I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, Reynolds announced loudly enough for the jogger to hear, but you need to come to a complete stop. Count to 3 before proceeding. I did come to a complete stop, Dr. Wilson said quietly. Reynolds leaned closer to the window, his voice dropping. Look, we both know what's happening here. Just take the warning and move on. Dr. Wilson's hands tightened on the steering wheel. And what exactly is happening here, Officer Reynolds? He glanced at the nameplate on Reynolds' uniform. Before Reynolds could answer, the radio on his shoulder crackled to life. All units be advised, Chief Walker is requesting the status of the traffic stop on Maple and Pine. Reynolds straightened up, surprised. How did the chief know about this routine stop? He keyed his radio. This is Reynolds. Just finishing up a warning for a stop sign violation. 10-4, came the reply. Chief Walker would like you to call him when you're clear. Reynolds felt a flicker of unease. He looked back at Dr. Wilson, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. You're free to go, Reynolds said abruptly. Remember what I said about stopping completely. I will remember everything about this stop, Officer Reynolds, Dr. Wilson replied, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. As Dr. Wilson rolled up his window and drove away, Reynolds stood on the curb, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. Something about the man's last words felt like a promise rather than a threat, and for the first time that afternoon, Reynolds wondered if he'd made a mistake. The radio crackled again. Reynolds, Chief Walker is waiting for your call. Reynolds walked back to his patrol car slowly, the swagger gone from his step. As he reached for his phone, he couldn't help but wonder why the chief would care about a simple traffic stop. He didn't know it yet, but this ordinary afternoon was about to become the turning point of his career and his life. Officer Reynolds sat in Chief Walker's office, his leg bouncing nervously as the chief reviewed the dashboard camera footage from the traffic stop. The office was quiet except for the faint voices coming from the computer speakers. Reynolds watched the chief's face darken as the video played. Chief Walker paused the footage and looked up. Would you care to explain what I just saw, Officer Reynolds? Reynolds straightened in his chair. Just a routine traffic stop, sir. The driver ran a stop sign. Chief Walker rewound the footage, then pressed play. On screen, the silver BMW clearly came to a complete stop at the intersection before proceeding. That looked like running a stop sign to you? Chief Walker asked, his voice dangerously calm. Reynolds swallowed hard. The angle of the camera, don't. Chief Walker held up his hand. I've known you 6 years, Reynolds. This isn't the first complaint about your conduct during traffic stops, but it might be the last. Complaint? Reynolds frowned. The driver filed a complaint already? No, Chief Walker said, closing the laptop. But 3 separate citizens who witnessed the stop called in, and the driver happens to be on the hospital board with my wife. Reynolds felt a chill run through him. I didn't know who he was. That's exactly the problem, Chief Walker said. You shouldn't treat anyone the way you treated Dr. Wilson. But the fact that you had no idea who he was makes it worse, not better. Outside the office, the afternoon shift was changing over. Reynolds could hear the normal chatter and movement, the everyday sounds of the precinct that had always felt like home. Now those sounds seemed distant, as if he was already being pushed outside. I'm placing you on administrative leave, Chief Walker said, sliding a form across the desk. Effective immediately, pending review by Internal Affairs. Chief, that's not necessary, Reynolds protested. I can explain. I've seen the video, Reynolds. I heard the audio. There's nothing to explain. The chief's voice was tired. You laughed at him. You mocked him. You insinuated he didn't belong in his own neighborhood and that he couldn't possibly be a surgeon. Reynolds felt his face grow hot. Put like that, it sounded bad. But it wasn't how he saw it in the moment. I was just being cautious. You always tell us to trust our instincts. Your instincts? Chief Walker leaned forward. Or your prejudices? The question hung in the air between them. Reynolds had no answer. Turn in your badge and gun, Chief Walker said finally. The department psychologist will call you to schedule sessions. You'll need her clearance before you can even be considered for return to duty. Psychological evaluation? Reynolds stood up, anger flaring. For a traffic stop? That's ridiculous. Sit down, Chief Walker ordered, his voice sharp enough that Reynolds immediately complied. This isn't just about today. It's about a pattern, and if you can't see that pattern, then yes, you absolutely need to speak with the psychologist. Reynolds sat in stunned silence as the chief outlined the complaints against him over the years. Traffic stops that targeted certain drivers. Reports filed with questionable language. Use of force incidents that always seem to happen with one demographic. I've looked the other way too long, Chief Walker admitted, regret evident in his voice. I kept hoping you'd grow out of it or that the sensitivity training would take hold. That's on me. But it stops today. As Reynolds left the chief's office 30 minutes later, he felt the stares of his fellow officers. News traveled fast in a small precinct. He kept his eyes down as he cleaned out his locker, ignoring the whispers. Officer Chen approached as Reynolds was zipping up his duffel bag. Tough break, man. Reynolds grunted in response. For what it's worth, Chen said quietly. I tried to warn you. I don't need your pity, Reynolds snapped. Chen shook his head. It's not pity. It's concern. For you, for the department, for the community we're supposed to protect. You're a good cop in many ways, Reynolds. But you've got a blind spot the size of Texas. Reynolds shouldered past him without responding. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture, especially not from Chen, who everyone called the Boy Scout behind his back for his by-the-book approach. The drive home felt surreal. Reynolds had never left a shift in the middle of the day before, had never driven home in his civilian clothes when he should have been in uniform. The administrative leave form sat on the passenger seat like an unwelcome companion. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. It was his mother. Michael, are you coming for dinner tonight? Your father's been asking when you'll visit. Reynolds closed his eyes. His father, the last person he wanted to see right now. I don't think I can make it tonight, Mom. Oh. Her disappointment was clear. Your father was hoping to thank that doctor again. He's coming for coffee after dinner. Reynolds froze. What doctor? The one who saved your father's life, of course. Dr. Wilson is stopping by. Such a kind man. He checks on your father every few weeks, even though it's been months since the surgery. The world seemed to tilt beneath Reynolds's feet. Dr. Wilson? Anthony Wilson? The heart surgeon? Yes, that's him. Your father keeps that thank you card on his bedside table. You know your father isn't emotional, but he cried when he wrote that card. Said he finally understood what it meant to be given a second chance. Reynolds leaned against his car for support. Mom, I need to ask you something. What does Dr. Wilson look like? What a strange question, his mother replied. He's tall, distinguished looking. Always wears a tie, even on weekends. Why do you ask? Is he black? Yes, of course. He's originally from somewhere down south, I think. Georgia, maybe? He told us a lovely story about his grandfather being one of the first black doctors in his hometown. Michael, why are you asking these questions? Reynolds couldn't answer. His throat had closed up completely. Michael, are you still there? I have to go, Mom. I'll call you later. He hung up before she could protest. Inside his house, Reynolds went straight to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The man who stared back at him looked haunted. 6 months ago, his father had collapsed at a family barbecue. Heart attack, massive and sudden. Reynolds had performed CPR while they waited for the ambulance, his police training kicking in automatically. But at the hospital, the doctors had been grim. His father needed emergency surgery, complex and risky. Dr. Wilson had been the surgeon on call that day. Reynolds remembered pacing the waiting room, remembered the surgeon coming out still in his scrubs, remembered the gentle way he'd explained the procedure and the careful way he'd laid out the recovery process. Reynolds had shaken the man's hand, had thanked him with tears in his eyes, had promised anything at all, if he could just save his father, and today, he had pulled that same man over and treated him like a criminal. The realization hit Reynolds like a physical blow. He barely made it to the toilet before he threw up. Hours later, Reynolds sat in his darkened living room, his father's get-well card in his hands. He had found it in a drawer, forgotten among bills and junk mail. Inside, Dr. Wilson had written a personal note along with his signature. "It was my privilege to care for your father. Every life is precious, every heart valuable beyond measure. Remember to treasure the time you have together." Reynolds read the words over and over, shame burning through him like acid. His phone lay on the coffee table, the screen showing a dozen missed calls. His mother wondering why he wasn't at dinner. The police psychologist trying to schedule his first appointment, Chief Walker, probably checking to make sure he was okay. Reynolds ignored them all. Instead, he pulled up the department's online portal and began to type his formal apology. Not because he had to, not because it might save his job, but because for the first time, he understood exactly what he had done and who he had done it to. The man who had saved his father's life had been treated like a criminal by the very son whose tearful thanks he had accepted with grace and humility. Reynolds typed through the night, deleting and rewriting, struggling to find words adequate for his shame. By dawn, his eyes were red and his hands shaking, but the letter was done. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a beginning. Dr. Wilson sat in his office at Memorial Hospital staring at the formal apology letter he'd received that morning. The department letterhead seemed almost comically official for what was at its heart a deeply personal matter. He placed the letter down and rubbed his tired eyes. 3 days had passed since the traffic stop. 3 days of turning the incident over in his mind during quiet moments between surgeries and patient consultations. 3 days of colleagues noticing his distraction but being too polite to ask about it directly. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, quickly sliding the letter into a drawer. Nurse Taylor poked her head in. "Your 4 o'clock canceled, so you have an unexpected break." She smiled. "And Mrs. Reynolds called to confirm you're still coming for coffee tonight." Dr. Wilson froze. "Mrs. Reynolds?" "The woman whose husband had the triple bypass 6 months ago," Nurse Taylor reminded him. "You've been checking on him every few weeks. She called to make sure you were still coming by tonight since you missed the dinner 2 nights ago." The connection hadn't occurred to him until this moment. Reynolds, the officer who had pulled him over, whose name had been displayed on the badge that Dr. Wilson had made a point to memorize, was named Reynolds. It couldn't be a coincidence, not in a town this size. "Thank you," he said to Nurse Taylor, his mind racing. "Please tell her I'll be there." After she left, Dr. Wilson reopened the drawer and took out the letter. He read it again, this time with new understanding. The officer had known exactly who he was when he wrote this, not just a random black driver he had harassed, but the surgeon who had saved his father's life. The apology took on new dimensions, layers of shame and regret evident in every carefully chosen word. It wasn't just a form letter sent to avoid a lawsuit. It was a confession. Dr. Wilson leaned back in his chair, memories of the Reynolds case coming back to him in vivid detail. A retired firefighter, stubborn and proud, who had nearly died on his operating table. The son, a police officer, who had performed CPR until the ambulance arrived, likely saving his father's life before Dr. Wilson ever saw him. The family gathered in the waiting room, their faces drawn with worry and hope. He remembered them all clearly now. And he remembered Officer Reynolds shaking his hand afterward, tears streaming down his face, gratitude pouring out of him in a jumble of words. The same man who had laughed in his face at the traffic stop. Dr. Wilson closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the weight of being seen as a threat until proven otherwise, the weight of having to be exceptional just to be treated as equal, the weight of watching someone's entire perception change when they discovered his credentials, as if doctor was the only title that made him worthy of respect. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Coming home for dinner?" "Not tonight," he texted back. "Making a house call. I'll explain later." The drive to the Reynolds home that evening felt like crossing some invisible boundary. Dr. Wilson had kept his professional and personal lives carefully separated from his experiences with law enforcement. Those were different worlds that rarely intersected, until now. The modest house sat on a quiet street lined with mature trees. Dr. Wilson had been here twice before to check on Mr. Reynolds, but this time he sat in his car for several long minutes gathering his thoughts. Finally, he walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Mrs. Reynolds answered with a warm smile. "Dr. Wilson, we're so glad you could make it. Please come in." The living room was cozy and well lived in. Mr. Reynolds sat in a recliner, the same chair he'd been in during the previous visits. He looked stronger now, his color good, the surgery scar on his chest hidden beneath a comfortable flannel shirt. "Doc," Mr. Reynolds said, struggling to stand. "Great to see you. Please stay seated," Dr. Wilson said, crossing the room to shake the older man's hand. "You're looking well. Feeling well, too. Been walking a mile every day, just like you told me." Mrs. Reynolds bustled in with coffee and a plate of cookies. "I've made your coffee black the way you like it. Please sit down." Dr. Wilson took a seat on the couch, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. He looked around casually. "Is your son joining us?" The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Mr. Reynolds looked down at his hands. Mrs. Reynolds nearly spilled the coffee. She was pouring for her husband. "I don't think so," she said after an uncomfortable pause. He hasn't been feeling well." "I'm sorry to hear that," Dr. Wilson replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Nothing serious, I hope." Mr. Reynolds looked up, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you know? When you agreed to come tonight, did you know?" Mrs. Reynolds shot her husband a warning look, but Dr. Wilson held up his hand. "It's all right. And yes, I figured it out today. Officer Reynolds is your son, the same Officer Reynolds who pulled me over a few days ago." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Mr. Reynolds sighed deeply. "He's a good boy at heart, Doc, always has been, but he's got some wrong ideas in his head. Ideas I probably didn't do enough to correct when he was younger." Mrs. Reynolds set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "He's been placed on leave. They're making him see a therapist." There was defensiveness in her tone, but also genuine distress. Dr. Wilson nodded slowly. "I received his letter of apology this morning. It seems sincere." "He hasn't left his house in 3 days," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice cracking slightly. "Won't answer our calls. The chief drove by to check on him and said he looks terrible." Dr. Wilson sat back, considering. This wasn't what he had expected. He had come here thinking he might need to confront the officer's parents, to make them understand what their son had done. Instead, he found them already carrying the weight of it. "He was raised better than this," Mr. Reynolds said firmly. "My father was a civil rights activist in the 60s. Marched with Dr. King. I've got the photos in our family album." He shook his head. Somewhere along the way, Michael lost sight of those values. The job changed him. Or maybe he just changed, and the job gave him power to act on it. Dr. Wilson thought of his own father, who had taught him how to survive traffic stops. Hands visible, movements slow, voice calm and respectful no matter what. Never give them a reason. The rules passed down through generations of black men. The terrible inheritance of fear. "I'd like to speak with him," Dr. Wilson said finally. Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds exchanged a look of surprise. "You would?" Mrs. Reynolds asked. "After how he treated you?" "Because of how he treated me," Dr. Wilson clarified. "And because of how he treated me 6 months ago, when his father was my patient. Those were 2 very different interactions with the same person. I'd like to understand why." Mr. Reynolds nodded slowly. "He lives about 10 minutes from here. Small apartment near the lake." He wrote down the address on a notepad. "I can't promise he'll open the door." "That's all right," Dr. Wilson said, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. "I'm used to difficult patients." Before he left, Mrs. Reynolds stopped him at the door. "Why are you doing this, Dr. Wilson?" "You could have filed a complaint. Could have made things much worse for him." Dr. Wilson considered the question carefully. "I believe in healing," he said finally. "It's not just about fixing what's physically broken. Sometimes it's about addressing the deeper wounds, the ones we can't see but that cause the most damage." "You're a good man," Mrs. Reynolds said, her eyes bright with tears. "I'm just a man," Dr. Wilson corrected gently, "who wants to be seen as one." The drive to Officer Reynolds' apartment was short, but it gave Dr. Wilson time to question his decision. He wasn't a therapist or a counselor. He was a surgeon, trained to cut out disease and repair damage with precise physical actions. The kind of healing needed here was far less straightforward. As he parked outside the small apartment complex, Dr. Wilson reminded himself that he wasn't doing this just for Officer Reynolds. He was doing it for himself, for his own sons who would someday drive these same streets, for every patient who deserved to be seen as a person first, regardless of their skin color. He was doing it because sometimes the hardest path forward was also the only one worth taking. Dr. Wilson took a deep breath and stepped out of his car, ready to face the man who had laughed at him just 3 days ago, the man who now knew exactly who he was. Officer Reynolds opened his apartment door on the third knock, his appearance shocking even to Dr. Wilson, who was used to seeing people at their worst. The officer's eyes were bloodshot, his face unshaven, and he wore the same clothes he had likely been wearing for days. Recognition dawned on his face immediately, followed by disbelief and then shame so profound it seemed to physically push him backward. "Dr. Wilson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you—" "Your parents," Dr. Wilson replied simply. "May I come in?" Reynolds stood frozen for a moment, then stepped aside wordlessly. The apartment was small but would have been nice if not for the current state of neglect. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table. Unwashed dishes filled the sink. The blinds were drawn, casting the room in gloomy shadows. "I wasn't expecting visitors," Reynolds mumbled, hastily clearing some clothes from the couch. "Clearly," Dr. Wilson said, but without judgment. He remained standing, taking in the space. A police academy graduation photo hung on one wall. Beside it, a picture of Reynolds and his father fishing together. "I just came from your parents' house." Reynolds stiffened. "They told you what happened?" "They didn't need to. I put it together when I realized the connection." Dr. Wilson finally sat down on the cleared space of the couch. "Your letter arrived this morning." Reynolds remained standing, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "I meant every word." "I believe you did," Dr. Wilson said. "Which is why I'm here instead of in a lawyer's office." Reynolds flinched at that, then finally sank into the armchair across from Dr. Wilson. "I would understand if you wanted to sue, or press charges for harassment." Dr. Wilson studied the man before him. Gone was the arrogant officer who had laughed in his face. This man looked broken, hollowed out by his own actions. "What happened that day, Officer Reynolds?" "I'd like to hear your perspective." Reynolds looked surprised at the question. "My perspective doesn't matter. What I did was wrong. I agree that it was wrong," Dr. Wilson said evenly. "But I still want to understand why it happened." Reynolds ran a hand over his face, then through his unwashed hair. "I don't have a good answer for you, Dr. Wilson. I don't need a good answer. I need an honest one." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Reynolds let out a long breath. "I saw a black man in an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood," he admitted, his voice hollow. "And I made assumptions. Assumptions I've been making for years without really examining them." Dr. Wilson nodded, encouraging him to continue. "When I was a rookie, I had a training officer who taught me to look for things that don't belong." That was his phrase. "People who don't fit the neighborhood. Cars too nice for the driver." He never explicitly mentioned race, but Reynolds trailed off, the implication clear. "And you internalized that lesson," Dr. Wilson observed. "I did, and I never questioned it. Even when other officers like Chen would call me out. I just thought they were soft, not street smart." Reynolds looked directly at Dr. Wilson for the first time. "But that's not the worst part." "What's the worst part?" "The worst part is that I didn't recognize you," Reynolds said, his voice cracking. "You saved my father's life. I shook your hand. I thanked you. I prayed for you that night," Dr. Wilson actually prayed, thanking God for sending you to save my dad. Dr. Wilson absorbed this quietly. "But when I saw you in that car," Reynolds continued, "none of that mattered. I didn't see the brilliant surgeon. I didn't see the man my family owes everything to. I just saw—" He stopped, unable to finish. "You just saw my skin." Dr. Wilson completed the thought. Reynolds nodded, shame evident in every line of his body. "Do you know what I thought when you pulled me over?" Dr. Wilson asked, his tone still remarkably calm. Reynolds looked up, waiting. "I thought, here we go again. Not anger, not surprise, just resignation." Dr. Wilson leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand what that means, Officer Reynolds? That a man my age, with my education, with my position in this community, sees flashing lights in his rearview mirror and thinks, "Here we go again?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "I'm starting to." "When you laughed at me," Dr. Wilson continued, "when you mocked the idea that I could be a surgeon, do you know what I was thinking?" Reynolds shook his head. "I was thinking about my sons, about the fact that someday they'll be driving too, and they'll get pulled over by someone like you, someone who looks at them and sees a threat or a criminal or something that doesn't belong, and maybe that officer won't just laugh. Maybe he'll do worse." Reynolds paled visibly as if the thought had never occurred to him before. "That's what was going through my mind," Dr. Wilson said. "Not anger at you personally. Fear for my children. The same fear my father felt for me, and his father for him." Reynolds stood up abruptly and walked to the window, pulling open the blinds. Light flooded the dim room, making both men blink. Outside, the afternoon sun sparkled on the lake. "I've been sitting in the dark for 3 days," Reynolds said, his back to Dr. Wilson. "Thinking about everything, about who I've been as a police officer, about the damage I've done." He turned around. "The chief has me seeing the department psychologist. She's having me review all my traffic stops for the past year. The pattern is—" He stopped, struggling for words. "Obvious?" Dr. Wilson suggested. "Damning," Reynolds corrected. "I've been pulling over black and brown drivers at 4 times the rate of white drivers, making arrests at 6 times the rate. Using force—" He shook his head, unable to continue. Dr. Wilson stood up as well, closing some of the distance between them. "And now that you see the pattern?" "I can't unsee it," Reynolds said simply. "I can't go back to who I was before. But I don't know if I can be a police officer anymore. I don't know if I should be." Dr. Wilson considered this. "When I make a mistake in surgery, not a mistake of bias, but a genuine error of technique. Do you know what happens?" Reynolds frowned at the apparent change of subject. "No, I have to report it. I have to face review by my peers. I have to learn from it so I never make that same mistake again." Dr. Wilson's voice took on the precision he used when explaining procedures to patients. "But no one suggests I should stop being a surgeon. They expect me to become a better one." Reynolds blinked, processing this. "The community doesn't need fewer police officers, Officer Reynolds. It needs better ones. Officers who can recognize their biases and work to overcome them. Officers who see the humanity in every person they encounter, regardless of what they look like or what neighborhood they're driving through." "You think I can be that kind of officer?" Reynolds asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "I think you have a choice," Dr. Wilson replied. "You can hide in the dark, ashamed of what you've done, or you can step into the light and do the hard work of becoming someone different, someone better." Reynolds turned back to the window, staring out at the sun-drenched world outside. "Why are you here, Dr. Wilson? Why talk to me at all after what I did?" Dr. Wilson moved to stand beside him at the window. "Because I believe in second chances. Your father got one on my operating table. Perhaps this is yours." They stood side by side, looking out at the lake. The unlikely pair connected by a series of events neither could have predicted. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Reynolds said finally. "I haven't offered it." Dr. Wilson replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Forgiveness is earned through actions, not words. What you do next will determine whether you're worthy of it." Reynolds nodded slowly, understanding. "The department's review board meets next week," he said. "They'll decide whether I can return to duty. The chief thinks they might let me come back on probation, with mandatory ongoing counseling and community service." "And what do you want them to decide?" Dr. Wilson asked. Reynolds turned to face him directly. "A week ago, I would have fought to get back to normal as quickly as possible. To put this behind me." He shook his head. "Now I think I need the probation, the counseling, the supervision. I need to prove to myself that I can be different before I ask the community to trust me again." For the first time since arriving, Dr. Wilson smiled slightly. "That," he said, "sounds like a good beginning." As he prepared to leave, Dr. Wilson paused at the door. "Your father's follow-up appointment is next month. I expect to hear about your progress then." Reynolds nodded, understanding the implicit message. This conversation wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a longer process of accountability. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steadier than it had been. "I didn't deserve this chance." "No," Dr. Wilson agreed as he opened the door. "But you have it anyway. What matters is what you do with it." As the door closed behind Dr. Wilson, Reynolds stood in his brightened apartment, seeing clearly for the first time in days, perhaps for the first time in years. The path forward wouldn't be easy. It would be uncomfortable, painful even, but it was a path he now knew he needed to walk. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Mom, it's me. I'm okay, and I'm ready to talk." 6 months later, Dr. Wilson stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at the faces that filled every seat in the large room. Some were familiar: hospital colleagues, neighbors, patients. Others were new to him: community activists, city officials, police officers in uniform and in civilian clothes. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room. "When we started these community dialogue sessions 6 months ago, I wasn't sure anyone would show up. That first night we had 12 people sitting in a circle, barely willing to look at each other, let alone talk. Soft laughter rippled through the audience. Many of them had been in that first circle. Tonight we have over 200 people," Dr. Wilson continued. "That tells me something important is happening in our town, something that was long overdue." In the front row, Officer Reynolds sat beside Chief Walker. Reynolds looked different now, clear-eyed, focused, present in a way he hadn't been before. The past 6 months had changed him, reshaped him through difficult conversations and harder realizations. "Our topic tonight is building trust after harm," Dr. Wilson said. "We have panelists from the police department, from community organizations, and from neighborhoods that have historically experienced tension with law enforcement. But before we hear from them, I want to share a personal story that some of you may already know." He recounted the traffic stop briefly, not dwelling on the details but not minimizing them either. He described the subsequent meeting in Reynolds' apartment. And then he spoke about what had happened since. Officer Reynolds returned to duty 3 months ago, after extensive training and psychological evaluation, Dr. Wilson explained. He asked to be assigned to community policing in neighborhoods he had previously patrolled with bias. He requested the most diverse areas, the ones he had once seen only through the lens of stereotype and suspicion. Reynolds looked down briefly, then raised his eyes again, accepting this public acknowledgement of his past failings. Many people, including some in this room tonight, questioned whether he should wear the badge again, Dr. Wilson continued. Those concerns were valid. Trust once broken is not easily repaired, but the harder path is not always the wrong one. In the back of the room, Officer Chen leaned against the wall, arms crossed but expression thoughtful. Beside him stood several other officers from the precinct, some still skeptical of the whole process, others increasingly convinced. "I believe in second chances," Dr. Wilson said, echoing the words he had spoken in Reynolds' apartment months earlier. "But I also believe in accountability." Officer Reynolds didn't just return to his job as if nothing had happened. He came back changed, committed to being part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. Reynolds swallowed hard, clearly moved by these words from a man he had once treated with such disrespect. "But this isn't just about one officer or one traffic stop," Dr. Wilson continued. "What happened to me happens to people in our community every day. The difference is that most don't have the protection of a white coat or medical degree. Most don't have the chief of police's wife on their hospital board. Most don't have the privilege that made my complaint impossible to ignore." The room was silent now, everyone focused intently on his words. Real change doesn't come from one incident or one conversation. It comes from sustained effort and uncomfortable truths. It comes from being willing to see patterns of harm and taking concrete steps to address them. Dr. Wilson gestured to a table of printed materials at the side of the room. "That's why tonight we're distributing the results of the department's 6-month audit of traffic stops, use of force incidents and arrests broken down by race, gender, and neighborhood." Chief Walker nodded, having approved the release of the data despite resistance from some officers and city officials. The numbers weren't flattering to the department, but transparency was a necessary first step toward accountability. "The data shows we still have work to do," Dr. Wilson acknowledged. "But it also shows improvement. Traffic stops of minority drivers are down 28%. Use of force incidents have decreased by 35%. And the number of citizen complaints has dropped dramatically." He stepped away from the podium and moved to the center of the stage. "Now I'd like to invite our panelists to join me. And our first speaker has a unique perspective on this issue." Reynolds stood up and walked to the stage. Visibly nervous but determined, Dr. Wilson shook his hand, the gesture witnessed by everyone in the room, a public demonstration of a private journey. 6 months ago, I was placed on administrative leave after a traffic stop that exposed my bias and prejudice. Reynolds began, his voice quiet but steady. I pulled over Dr. Wilson because he was a black man driving an expensive car in a wealthy neighborhood. I laughed at him when he told me he was a surgeon. I treated him like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. Reynolds paused, gathering himself. What I didn't know then was that this man had saved my father's life 6 months earlier. He had performed open-heart surgery on my dad. 8 hours of precision and care that gave my family years we might not have had otherwise. A murmur went through the audience. When I realized who he was, I was ashamed. Deeply, profoundly ashamed. Not just because I had treated my father's savior with disrespect, but because I had to ask myself a terrible question. Why did it take that personal connection for me to see Dr. Wilson as a human being worthy of dignity? The room was utterly silent now. I've spent the last 6 months trying to answer that question, Reynolds continued. Working with therapists, with community leaders, with fellow officers who have challenged me to be better. I've had to face ugly truths about myself and about patterns in my policing that I had never examined before. He looked out at the audience, making eye contact with faces black and white, young and old. I'm still learning. I'm still making mistakes. But I'm committed to the work of becoming the kind of officer who serves all members of this community with equal respect and care. Not because I might pull over someone who saved my dad's life, but because every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like or what car they drive or what neighborhood they're in. As Reynolds continued to speak, Dr. Wilson watched the audience. He saw skepticism on some faces, hope on others. He saw his son sitting in the third row, listening intently to a police officer acknowledge harm and commit to change. He saw Chief Walker nodding in agreement. He saw community activists who had been demanding police reform for years, finally hearing the beginning of the conversation they had been trying to start. Later that evening, as people mingled after the formal program, Dr. Wilson found himself standing next to Reynolds at the refreshment table. That couldn't have been easy, Dr. Wilson said. Pouring himself a cup of coffee, Reynolds shook his head. Easiest thing I've done in months, actually. At least compared to the daily work. Dr. Wilson raised an eyebrow. The daily work? Checking myself. Questioning my instincts when they might be biases in disguise. Having conversations with other officers who still think this is all political correctness gone too far. Reynolds gave a small smile. The talking part is easy. The doing part is hard. Dr. Wilson nodded, understanding. My father used to say that real change happens slowly, then all at once. Like water wearing away at a stone. It seems like nothing's happening for the longest time, and then suddenly the stone cracks open. Which part do you think we're at? Reynolds asked. The slowly or the all at once? Dr. Wilson looked around the room at the unlikely gathering of people engaged in honest conversation. Both, maybe. For some people here, this is the first crack in the stone. For others, it's been a lifetime of pushing against it. Reynolds considered this. I used to think I was one of the good ones, you know. Not a bad cop. Not a racist. I couldn't see the water wearing away at me, changing how I saw the world, how I treated people. And now? Now I know better, Reynolds said simply. And I have to do better. Every day, every traffic stop, every interaction. Not because someone's watching, but because it's right. Across the room, Reynolds' father caught Dr. Wilson's eye and raised his coffee cup in a small salute of thanks. Beside him, 2 of Dr. Wilson's colleagues from the hospital were deep in conversation with community activists they would never have met otherwise. 6 months ago, Dr. Wilson said quietly, I thought the best outcome would be you losing your badge. I wanted you off the streets, away from people you could harm. Reynolds nodded, accepting this. I was thinking too small, Dr. Wilson continued. 1 officer removed doesn't change the system. But 1 officer transformed. He left the thought unfinished. Can make a difference, Reynolds completed. I hope. Dr. Wilson smiled slightly. Hope is a good place to start. Action is where the real work happens. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Dr. Wilson's younger son approached, eyeing Reynolds with curiosity. Dad, we should go soon. Mom just texted that she's waiting in the car. I'll be right there, Dr. Wilson assured him. Thomas, this is Officer Reynolds. The boy extended his hand with the careful politeness of a child who has been well raised, but is naturally cautious around police. Reynolds shook it gently. It's good to meet you, Thomas. My dad says you're helping make things better, the boy said directly. Reynolds glanced at Dr. Wilson, then back to his son. I'm trying, he answered honestly. Every day I'm trying, the boy nodded, accepting this answer. Good, he said simply. Because someday I'll be driving too. The words, so similar to what Dr. Wilson had said in Reynolds' apartment months ago, hung in the air between them, a reminder of why all this mattered. Why the uncomfortable conversations and hard truths were necessary. For Reynolds, for Dr. Wilson, for the community they both served, and especially for the next generation who deserved better than the broken systems they had inherited. It wasn't an ending. It was barely even a beginning, but it was a step forward on a long road towards something better, something that might someday resemble justice.